The American Civil War will come to an end in April of 1865, essentially through a partnership between General Grant and General Sherman. These two officers have been working together, certainly since the Battle of Fort Donelson back in 1862, in the first winter of the war. And one, of course, will become the commander in chief, Grant, of the United States Army. Grant will pursue, as I had described in the last lecture, in the previous lecture, the final campaign, the Petersburg-Richmond campaign, where he'll surround Richmond and then begin squeezing around Petersburg, almost in the same way as the Anaconda Plan has been squeezing the Confederacy in a strategic move as well. Sherman, in the meantime, had taken Atlanta and then began his infamous march to the sea, to Savannah, up north into South Carolina, passing through Charleston, then into North Carolina, and he'll eventually finish up at Bentonville. And you can see how, of course, between Sherman and Grant's push from the north, the last remaining armed force of the Confederacy, the Army of Tennessee here in the West, and the Army of Northern Virginia at Richmond and Petersburg, are being now squeezed into a very small territory. By now, the Confederate lines are thin. Many Confederates have deserted. It's really hopeless. Some of them are the ones fighting at Petersburg, at Richmond in those trenches, are just young boys or old men. The Confederates had just sustained so many casualties that having a smaller population, they could not really sustain. And so it ends in the north with the final face-off between Ulysses S. Grant and Robert E. Lee. The final ending week, the Confederates withdraw from Richmond as the Union Army enters into Richmond on the night of April 2nd and 3rd. And now for the next week, the Confederates will make these kinds of forays and attempts to escape the Union Army that is pursuing them, which is significantly outnumbering them. The Confederate Army as well is not only ragged and tired and thin, but it has no supplies, no food. They're chased by General Sheridan and Meade, by Grant here. And so everyone, the entire might of the United States, is beginning to press down on the Confederate Army. What Robert E. Lee hopes to do is to be able to kind of escape the Union encirclement and find another position where he could carry on maybe a conventional war, maybe a guerrilla war. In some ways, he believes that abandoning Richmond actually will give him freedom, will free him of these kind of static defense lines he finds himself holding to protect Richmond, the capital. However, it's not turning out that way. He's just too outnumbered and undersupplied and have a shortage of rations. And on the night of April 8th and 9th, finally, Robert E. Lee decides he really has no option to but surrender. Grant, in fact, writes him a letter stating that, both you and I are aware that your situation is hopeless, but, any further loss of life is going to be on you now, because, we've been ready to make the peace for ages now, and it's hopeless for you. And Robert E. Lee realizes this now. And so April 9th, they will now do a formal surrender meeting at Appomattox Station in the Appomattox courthouse. The Appomattox, Grant is waiting for Robert E. Lee to arrive. They enter the house there, and Grant actually knows Robert E. Lee. He had seen him and met him. He knows who he is. He had seen him and met him in the Mexican-American War. Grant, of course, at that time was a junior officer, but Lee, being a senior officer, didn't remember Grant. But it is, as I say, a very formal meeting, and they now sign the Articles of Surrender. Grant, almost regrettably, in a strange way. It's a sad scene. It's a very civil process, and Grant offers Robert E. Lee and his men relatively generous terms. Men who own their own horses can keep their horses and bring them back to where they lived, to farm, whatever. Grant as well issues Union rations to the hungry Confederate Army. And officers, Robert E. Lee expected to be arrested and surrender his sword and be taken prisoner, but Grant does no such thing. Robert E. Lee will, after signing the surrender papers, will ride away through his men. And that is essentially the end of it. There are stories how there's this kind of, again, teary, sad farewell between Grant and his men, how his men run their hands along Robert E. Lee's horse, Traveler, and how Robert E. Lee essentially rides off into the sunset. And he'll become he won't, there'll be no charges pending against any of the Confederates in an attempt to, again, other than those committed war crimes, as in the case of Wirtz, the superintendent of the Andersonville prisoner of war camp. And Grant will, Robert E. Lee will eventually become an instructor at a military school, and then will retire and live out the rest of his life, as I say, in retirement. There is then a formal ceremony of surrender where men surrender their arms and so forth, and then are essentially dismissed from military service and return. So we see mid-April as the ending period, the ending of the formal ending of the Civil War, depending on whether it's the signature of the Articles of Surrender or the actual formal ending of ceremonial ending of the war, which occurred several days later. But it's over, almost over, because in some parts of the United States, the Confederates fight on. Firstly, sometimes the news doesn't reach them. Other times, local state issues continue to result in smaller Civil War battles, hung over from the war, kind of in the way Bleeding Kansas was before the war. It's often said that the last battle of the American Civil War was actually in a few months later, a month later, in fact, in May of 1865, the Battle of Palmito Ranch, right on the border of Mexico on the Rio Grande River. Interestingly enough, no one exactly knows why this battle was fought. It was a Union Army attack on Confederate positions, and the Confederates actually won the battle. They inflicted something like 3 or 4 times the casualties they sustained on the Union. But of course, it's pointless, the entire exercise of this battle. And some again suggest that this was really a battle between secessionist Texans and Unionist Texans, that this was a internal Texas battle. So for all intents and purposes, April 1865 puts an end to the war. It's over. So the question, of course, is here, why has the Union won? Or maybe, there's a subtle difference. Why did the Confederacy lose? We certainly saw that there were serious demographic differences between the Confederacy and the Union, which made it very difficult for the Confederacy to maintain and sustain an industrial war of the scale that was necessary. And partly, of course, because soldiers, manpower are still very much essential on the battlefield, as you saw how battles were fought. The fact that the Union outnumbered the Confederacy nearly 44 to 1, of course, creates a huge problem for the Confederacy. I mean, the North could raise 4 men to every 1 man the South can muster in the field. And that's the first part of the problem. The other part, of course, is, again, the issue of fighting a modern war, the industrial lack of parity between the North and the South. I mean, the North was producing 97% of all firearms, 94% of all textiles, 93% of pig iron, 90% of footwear, and more importantly, the 31,000 miles of railway in the United States, only 9,000 of it was located in the Confederate States. And that is going to disadvantage the very advantage that the Confederate Confederacy had, their kind of agrarian base that, they could feed their soldiers and their people, and yet they couldn't, because whatever they could grow without that efficient railway system would have been difficult for them to um, to distribute, and will be, to distribute. The other thing, of course, is the border states, Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, even though there are very strong secessionist Confederate movements in those states, the Union manages to keep control over them. The effect of adult male volunteers leaving for the battlefield is going to be felt immediately in the South, and felt most in territories with fewer slaves. As skilled laborers leave their workplaces to confront the Army of the Potomac gathering at the border of Virginia, towns and villages throughout the Confederacy are suddenly hit by shortages as shoemakers, harness makers, blacksmiths depart. Slave intense regions can replace these workers with slaves, but in other regions, less slave intensive, they are unable to do this. So while slave intense regions can replace these workers, less intense regions can. And by this process, shortages and the consequent rise in prices on scarce items made Southerners feel the effects of the war long before combat had actually arrived in their region. There is a resulting credit crisis. The problems of these shortages are going to be compounded with the departure of village storekeepers, suppliers, and craftsmen. And this leads to the collapse of a complex local credit system. This is an era, of course, before credit cards, before kind of centralized banking credit. So your face essentially is your credit, that you're known to the merchant. And now local farmers, villagers, if they need to get something on credit, and in their village, the supplier or store owner has now gone off to battle, villagers have to travel to the next village or town where they're unknown and cannot expect the kind of credit they would get from local merchants and from service owners who had grown up with them in the same community and knew them well. And so this kind of results in a collapse in regional credit overall that undermines the local commercial pillars that support a national economy of the South, piece by piece, the kind of a tapestry of regional credit systems. All this begins to undo very early in the war and has a tremendous impact on those who are attempting to carry on business or farming back home behind the battle lines. And of course, what they do is essential to the war effort. The other thing that one needs to take into account is the mindset in general of Confederate soldiers at the beginning of the war. reflecting that kind of American Republican militia Minuteman tradition that men volunteer immediately to defend their home region, and as soon as the enemy is repelled, they return home. The notion of serving in a long-term standing army that is engaged in a large-scale strategic industrial war is alien to Southerners, as it will be mostly alien to Northerners at that time too. Nobody had experienced that kind of war, but Southerners, of course, are more rooted in that kind of community response. The regiments are often community based. In the beginning of the war, militiamen expected to elect their officers. Some of them, in the tradition of militia, even had a kind of vote as to how the unit was going to be self-deployed into the battlefield. So all that in the immediate first months of the war is going to make it difficult and have a greater impact on the kind of community nature of the Confederacy as opposed to the kind of societal organized nature of the North. Remember, we talked about as well that notion of kind of organic and organized community, the differences between the two, between a organized society or a organic community. And so, for example, the defeat of the Union forces at Manassas in the beginning of the war, immediately after the battle, sparks all these massive returns. I think it's unfair to characterize these as desertions, but certainly that's what they are. They're desertions, but these massive returns of Confederate soldiers who had volunteered for battle and now felt that they had achieved the goal they had volunteered for, the defense of the Confederate border with the Union and the expulsion of the Union Army from Virginia. And so they now saw no sense in sitting in entrenchment if there were no further Union attacks. And certainly under McClellan, there would be no serious attacks at Virginia, at Manassas, until the next year. So many Confederate militias just disbanded and returned home. And of course, there were no plans to conquer the North either. So it wasn't like the Confederacy intended to occupy the North. For them, once they repelled the Union, their mission, they felt, had been done. And so many volunteers in the militia return home to attempt to restart their business or still perhaps complete the farming cycle before it was too late. And so General Albert Johnson will comment after Manassas, as scores of Confederate soldiers now pick up and go home, quote, exaggerated ideas of victory prevailing among our troops cost us more men than the Federal Army lost by defeat, end of quote. Union victories in other regions, like, for example, in West Virginia, also drove men from those regions who are serving in the Confederacy, in the Confederate Army elsewhere, to question why are they fighting in other parts of the country while their homes and farms and families were threatened by the enemy back home. And so many of them also deserted to add to the defense of their hometown or their home county or region. Discipline is difficult to maintain in the Confederate Army. Again, because most militia units were raised within small local villages and towns, there existed this kind of complicated kin and community relationship that often superseded the traditional military chain of command. Sons and father, employee and employers, masters and apprentices often served in the same union, in their same unit, and their relationship from civilian life often superseded military rank. That's why, again, militiamen expected to elect their officers and vote under units' deployment and policy at the beginning of the war. Supplying Confederate soldiers was entirely the responsibility of the local region, and supplies, as you already hear, were uneven and further compounded the problems of shortages at home. The problem is being made worse as well by Union successes in parts of the Confederate regions that cut off certain supplies. For example, the Union occupation of Virginia's Kanawha Valley cuts off most of Virginia's supply of salt. And salt, of course, is essential for preserving food for battlefield rations. The federal naval blockade cuts off the supply of leather from North and South America, while the absence of tanners who are now serving in the militia further reduces the domestic production of leather, which is essential for harnesses, for reins, for boots, for leather belts and webbing and so forth. Warfare itself strains the resources of communities. For example, after the Battle of Manassas, some 1,200 wounded Confederates now arrive in the nearby town of Charlottesville. The town has a population of only 3,000 people with only 300 available hospital beds, and yet suddenly in one day, 1,200 wounded arrive. As speculators began to drive prices for goods up, citizens began demanding that the Confederate government in Richmond now impose centralized price regulations, paradoxically impinging upon states' rights, the very cause of the Confederacy. As volunteer soldiers began to move back and forth across Virginia, a climate of disorder often followed. Towns filled up with drunken, young, armed strangers saw rates of theft, robbery, and violence escalate, and local police authorities found it difficult to deal with this large migrant population of young armed men sojourning in their communities. Liquor dealers profited in keeping these movements of men plied on drink. Aside from further encouraging disorder, an unusually high rate of liquor production now creates shortages in some basic food staples like sugar and corn that are diverted into the production of alcoholic drink. The first American military draft is actually not the one that Lincoln will introduce in the North, but one that Jefferson Davis introduces in the Confederacy. The CSA Conscription Act is enacted by the federal government in April of 1862, more than a year before the Union government did the same. The Confederacy takes this step because it has to. Its territory is now being assailed on every front by overwhelming numbers, and the defending armies needed men to fill ranks. When the war began, everybody volunteered, the Minutemen, so to speak, all volunteered and rushed into service. In fact, so many men turned up in the first month of the Civil War that some of them were actually sent back home because they just had more soldiers than they needed. All that changes after Manassas, as many of these soldiers choose to just go home or desert. And compulsory law service, conscription, was very unpopular in the South because, again, conscription is viewed as a usurpation of the rights of individuals by a central government. One of the reasons, again, is that the South went to war in the first place to fight the kind of Union federal centrality of the government in Washington. Under the CSA Conscription Act, all healthy white men between the ages of 18 and 35 will be liable for 3 years of service. The act also extended the term of enlistment for all soldiers who enlisted from 1 year to 3 years. In September 1862, an amendment raised the age limit to 45. And by February of 1864, the limits were extended to the range between 17 and 50. Exempted from the draft were men employed in certain occupations considered to be most valuable for the home front, such as railroad and river workers, civil officials, telegraph operators, miners, druggists, and teachers. October 11th, 1862, the Confederate Congress amends the draft law to exempt one person from any plantation or business that had 20 or more slaves. And furthermore, until this practice is abolished in December of 1863, wealthy drafted men could hire a substitute to take their place in the ranks, similar to the North. But this exemption for 20 or more slaves, once again, caused a lot of resentment among those men in service who typically owned one slave at best. And we already saw in the early first lectures just how few Confederates actually owned slaves, even one slave. And most did not have slaves, yet there were, again, fighting for the right of the Confederacy to keep slaves as property. And so now there's some, again, resentment similar to rich man's war, but a poor man's fight. If only I had 20 slaves, I wouldn't need to be fighting to defend my slaves. I could be at home on the plantation. And presumably, this exemption was to ensure that there's supervision of slaves. Many Southerners, including the governors of Georgia and North Carolina, are vehemently opposed to the national draft, and they work to thwart its effects in their states. Thousands of men on state level and local level end up being exempted for service by the sham addition of their names to the civil servant rolls or by their enlistment in local state militias. And we see that when we look at exemptions, of all exemptions for state service, something like 92% come from Georgia and North Carolina. So you have these two levels of conscription, state level and Confederate level. and it brings chaos to the conscription process. Available exemptions on the state level did not always apply on the Confederate level, or reverse. Officers disgruntled with service in far away places in the Confederate Army could resign their commission and take command in a state militia closer to home. Conscription, which determined who stayed at home and who went away, was of vital interest to any community. And so, as long as locally appointed boards ruled who had to serve and who could get an exemption to stay at home, communities felt some measure of control and security. But of course, the chaos and often corruption of this process results in the Confederate government to take over all conscription and centralize it in April of 1862. And so, although the Confederate government often will continue to go through local conscription mechanisms, they are now regulated by Richmond, and eventually local boards are replaced with a kind of neutral, disinterested Confederate Army boards that are not particularly sensitive to local needs or local community desires. So once again, this aggravates the threat to states' rights status, which had driven the states to go to war in the first place. And exemptions are a huge issue. The major exemption certainly wasn't the one male for every plantation with 20 or more slaves, because again, we saw statistically how few slave owners of more than 20 slaves there existed, and just how few people in the Confederacy owned any slaves at all, period. When we do look at the exemptions, we see that the vast majority of exemptions, 63%, were claimed under substitution, whereby an individual can pay another man to serve in his place. The substitution was not seen necessarily as unpatriotic or cowardly. Many felt that they had already served an early enlistment in the war, and so they didn't feel obliged to enlist again, this time for a 3-year period. And the concept behind this law was that if you were wealthy enough to hire a substitute, you probably are more valuable to the Confederacy behind the lines in a managerial, political, entrepreneurial, or professional capacity, as opposed to cannon fodder on the battlefield. So many poor Southerners actually supported substitution because it was a source of income for them. And the price of substitution would dramatically become inflated through 1862 and 1863, rising from $1,000 to $1,500 and eventually to $2,000. The problem, of course, for substitution was that you could only serve as a substitute if you were ineligible for the draft under the Confederate Act, which meant that only men over the age of 45 and then over 50 or non-residents could serve as substitutes. And many of these, just like up north, were con men, taking substitution payments and immediately deserting. And in fact, the desertion rates among substitutes approached as high as 80%. Following substitution, the second highest exemption category was for skilled workers, artisan category, a total of 12% of exemptions granted. In this case, you're looking at statistics for Virginia, granted in Virginia. And again, they reflected the concerns of communities losing their workers, to the war. So we can see how substitution really outweighs all the other various categories for exemption from the draft, including the 20 slave rule that was claimed by only 5.8% of draftees. Shortages will continue to plague the Confederate Army. In the last year of the war, after the fall of Atlanta and the setbacks in the Shenandoah Valley, the Confederacy will issue General Order number 77 on October 8th, 1864, which revokes all exemptions. All men between the ages of 18 and 45, whatever their status or skill, were now required to report for military training and stand by for combat assignments if needed. These shortages are also further aggravated by mass straggling and desertion that I had described in the Confederate Army. Straggling is similar to desertion. It's an offense under military rules and regulations. It's straggling is when soldiers continue facing in the direction of the war or the battlefield, but begin to fall behind the movement of their unit. And eventually, the idea is as they straggle behind and fall behind their unit goes into combat, which they avoid. And sometimes then they turn and head off in a different direction, becoming deserters. So again, the militia mentality of the Confederate Army created this culture of desertion. Particularly when soldiers decided to choose on their own that their military duty to defend their home was either fulfilled or threatened by their absence. Once a battle was won, many soldiers no longer felt their duty done and no longer felt that they needed to remain, and that now they felt their duty was done and their presence was no longer required. Because the militia nature of the Army units were geographically based, these units serving close to home had higher desertion rates, as their soldiers would sometimes leave to look in on their families and homes or take off to bring in the harvest. Some would return to duty. Those stationed further away from home, if they chose to desert, often would not return. Confederate officers, particularly on the tactical, regimental level, and company commanders, often had to tolerate the lack of discipline and desertion, very much understanding their men's concerns with their home and family. And of course, they're reluctant to punish fellow townspeople, especially when it comes to desertion, where the punishment, of course, is often the death penalty or executed by firing squad for desertion. And no officer, of course, wanted to execute anybody in his regiment who came from, their hometown, and then they got to come home, and all the kin and family are waiting in revenge for this officer to come back to settle scores for executing their son. Right? So Confederate officers were often reluctant to enforce this kind of discipline. The pressure is going to come from communities who feel threatened by roving bands of deserters and stragglers who, because of the shortages all around, often turn to crime to sustain themselves, either in their hiding out or their journey home. And so, in fact, It's the communities that are not local to the militiamen that are calling on a kind of harsher discipline now to be enforced by the Confederate Army on deserters and stragglers, which is what the Confederate Army will do. In the last months of the war, as the winter of 1864-65 comes, and it really becomes now evident that there is little hope remaining for the Confederacy, the desertion rates now just escalate out of control. Entire lines at Richmond and Petersburg begin to just evaporate as deserters leave. And it should be noticed that many of these late war deserters were not deserting out of cowardice, nor were they inexperienced soldiers. Some, in fact, of the more experienced soldiers who had previously distinguished themselves were prone to deserting near the end of the war. I think the way they looked at it is, they ran up their odds of survival, and, like a cat that has 9 lives, they've kind of reached their 8th life, and maybe it was time to give it up while they're still alive and have all their limbs still intact. Overall, life in the Confederacy was smothered by shortages and inflation. In the 6 months from 1862 to March of 1863, almost everything at least tripled in costs. Bacon went up from 35 cents a pound to $1.10 a pound. Flour, for example, that sold for $7.50 a barrel in 1860, cost $30 per barrel by 1863. By 1864, it was $168 per barrel. And after Sherman rips through the railway system supplying Virginia and its capital from the south, flour in Richmond was selling at the end of the war for $350 to $400 a barrel. People literally began to starve. And states now were required to come with scarce resources for relief and welfare. One Virginia county statistics just shows the dramatic effect. Henrico County, the county court which issued relief to soldiers' families, their budget in 1863 was $4,000. By the next year, 1864, the budget now was $172,000 for the relief of families at home or families and members of families that are orphaned or widowed by the death of the male in the family. This led to all sorts of divisions in Confederate society. Local farmers were accused of holding back their products from the community in order to sell them at higher prices in more distant markets where there were shortages. And of course, this caused shortages locally. But farmers were also facing rising operating costs that they had to pass down to consumers. Horseshoes that cost 25 cents in 1859 now cost $1 in 1863. Shoes for slaves rose in price from $1.50 a pair to $15. And again, remember the Battle of Gettysburg, sometimes by some historians is attributed to the Confederates turning towards the town in search for shoes. Slaves, that precious property the owners were defending in their rebellion, ironically became subject to requisition by the Confederate state for war labor requirements. army warehouses and workshops, military contractors and suppliers, factories, mines, and plantations all now competed for scarce slave labor. The government, both on a Confederate level and on a state level, exercised its power by conscripting slaves for war labor. In Virginia, for example, owners faced 7 separate slave requisitions, 3 by the state and 4 by the Confederacy. Owners complained that when their slaves ran away or were injured while requisitioned, the Confederate government failed to compensate them. And the government acknowledged the right of compensation, but failed to appropriate funds for it. And so owners now begin driving their slaves to distant territories to avoid the slaves from being requisitioned. So, ironically, many slave owners are losing their slaves not to the Union effort, but to their own Confederate government. The shortages, of course, in the Confederate Army will lead in the last months of the war for the Confederacy to adopt measures allowing now African Americans, slaves, to serve in the Confederate Army. In March of 1865, the Confederacy adopts the Barksdale Bill, which provided for African Americans to serve in the Confederate Army in combat. Despite the fact that the wisdom of now using enslaved soldiers without freeing them, or even promising them freedom, was extensively discussed and debated by the Confederates, the bill, when finally passed, made no provisions for the emancipation of those slaves who serve in the Confederate Army. The onus, essentially, was on the slave owner to volunteer, and I put that in quotation marks, to volunteer his slaves to the government, although authority was given to the president to conscript slaves if such voluntary sentiment was not forthcoming. It was Jefferson Davis, when he issued Adjutant and Inspector General's Office General Order Number 14, which had been argued was the, quote, Confederate emancipation of slaves that for the first time began to make a provision that these slaves will actually be free. General Order Number 14 stated, quote, that no slave will be accepted as a recruit unless with his own consent and with the approbation of his master by a written instrument conferring, as far as he may, the rights of a freed man. In other words, African American slaves had to be first freed to be able to serve in the Confederate Army. Bottom line is that these orders, these provisions come in the last month of the war, March, April 1865, and so very few, if any, African Americans end up on the battlefield wearing the gray of the Confederate Army. I never really came across any accounts of this. Although African American regiments are being formed and mustered by the Confederacy, I don't think they ever deployed them on the front line. So that's basic factor number one, why the Confederacy lost this war, or why the Union won it. Confederate society was in a poor position to support and supply a concerted industrial war effort. It's going to bleed out under the weight of its agrarian, underdeveloped nature, and as well in this kind of conflicting states' rights chaos that we've seen, in other lectures that, you know, define this um, secessionist movement. It was about states' rights, and certainly none of the Confederate states intended to replace the tyranny of Washington, D.C. now with a centralized tyranny of Richmond. So that's one of the paradoxical problems for the Confederates. The second factor I've already discussed in my lecture on battlefield tactics. Those casualties being inflicted because of the kind of tactics that have not caught up to the development of the rifle, of course, are casualties that the Union, with 4 times the population, can better tolerate and sustain than certainly the Confederates, who are outnumbered. Factor 3 is a problem that, because certainly the problem of those casualties do affect equally the Union and the Confederacy, aside from the fact that the Union had more soldiers. But this kind of backwardness in battlefield tactics in the face of the rifle is something that has impact on both Union and Confederate soldiers equally. The problem, part 3, really hits the Confederates more. The Confederate southern states represent an entirely different tradition and culture from the North. And this culture, of course, combined at a moment in the Civil War with a general emerging attack doctrine and military theory worldwide. The Union included that the way to defend your position is to attack. Always be on the attack. The problem, of course, is when this attack doctrine is taken up by Confederate, it already fits a very deep, pre-existing military culture in Southern society, with consequently disastrous results. Again, from those seminar readings, we saw how Southerners were more prone to duels, arms. There were more military schools in the South. There were a much more militaristic kind of agrarian society. And so already with this kind of general attack doctrine in military theory of that age, it further is aggravated by already this kind of pre-existing military culture in Southern society not to take an insult and attack. Grady McWhinney, in his book, Attack and Die, Civil War Military Tactics and the Southern Heritage, argues that the South represented a culture of immigrants of a Celtic background, Scots, Welsh, Irish, who had a tradition in their military, a history of rebellion and suicidal outnumbered attacks against a better equipped and supplied state power. In the case of, again, the Scots and the Welsh and the Irish, England, Britain. And in his book, McWhinney cites 2 examples very similar in scope and circumstances to the massacre of the Confederates, say, at Gettysburg, and in particular, Pickett's suicidal charge across an open field against Cemetery Ridge. McQuinney looks at the Battle of Telamon, just north of Rome in 225 BC, between Roman legions and Celtic tribal rebels, and the Battle of Culloden in 1746 between rebel Scot Jacobites and English redcoats under the Duke of Cumberland, Bloody Billy, the last land battle on mainland Britain. Both events, although centuries apart from the Civil War, McQuinney argues were clashes between suicidal, underarmed, impassionate, relatively backward volunteer tribal rebels on one side and cold, written law, advanced state and economic imperial power societies with professional or conscript armies on the other side. The state defender against the rebellion tended to win by sheer manpower and advanced technology and access to it, and its defensive position on the battlefield against a headlong rebel suicide charge, like the one you're looking at now by Celts in 225 BC, the Battle of Telamon against Roman legions. You know what everybody knows what a Roman soldier looks like, with those heavy shields which they would lock together, forming almost a kind of fortified wall. The shield, of course, was so heavy that it could be used as a weapon. You could break a man's leg by just slamming them with the edge of this heavy shield. Roman soldiers would put their shields together with a slight gap in between them, and they would thrust with their gladius sword between the crack, kind of like this spiny moving creature, as they would lift their shield and drop it, then thrust, lift their shield and drop it and thrust. Roman soldiers, of course, wore armor. But here you can see in this authentic drawing of what Celtic soldiers, Celtic rebels would have looked like at that time, you can see these tattooed warriors, bare-chested with tiny shields, just charging headlong into Roman lines. And indeed, the famous rebel yell that Confederates would let loose when they charge often is echoed from accounts by Roman soldiers of having fought the Celts, how the Celts would, when they're charging, let out this howl that Roman officers described as just sending this kind of corkscrew of fear up their spine at just the sound of it. McQuinney will write, quote, "Southerners lost the Civil War because they were too Celtic and their opponents were too English. The distinguished historian of the war's common soldiers, Belli Wiley, concluded that in many ways Johnny Reb and Billy Yank were quite different. Rebels fought, quote, with more dash, elan, and enthusiasm. They were more emotional, more religious, more humorous, and more poetical, says Wiley. They also had a more acute sense of the ludicrous, the dramatic, or the fanciful. Yanks, on the other hand, were more practical, were more materialistic, more literate, and they displayed more of a tenacity, stubbornness en masse, and machine-like efficiency. These and other distinctions that Wiley failed to mention are significant. They suggest that the Civil War was a conflict between two distinct people. And they also indicate the persistence over time of cultural patterns that seriously influenced, if they did not absolutely determine, the war's outcome. All the differences that Wiley recognized are cultural characteristics that separated not merely rebels and Yanks, but Celts and their historic enemies from antiquity to the American Civil War. Romans and Englishmen, like Yankees, were more practical, were more materialistic, more literate, more tenacious, and more machine-like than the Celts they fought, just as the Confederates and their Celtic forebears were more emotional, foolhardy, romantic, and undisciplined as their opponents. End of quote. This is an interesting theory. There is some controversy about it. This notion that Northerners represented a wave of immigrants from, Protestant England, while Southerners represented a later wave of immigrants from Celtic, more Catholic parts of Ireland and Wales and so forth. It's an interesting theory, but some academics are finding that the patterns of immigration, both to the north and the south, are not quite as simplistic as Celts all going, to the south, and it's all Protestant English going to the north. So it's not as simple as they say, but it is indeed true that Celts fought in similar ways that the Confederates are fighting, from their headlong attacks to the rebel yell, which again Roman historians described 2,000 years ago, as well. There was this kind of elan and almost tribal loyalty to their commanders, almost a Confederate general, as you saw with the case of Sidney Johnson when he led that attack at the Battle of Shiloh, often fought along with their soldiers like tribal chiefs would. And we'll see there'll be a much higher rate of Confederate generals being killed in this war than there will be Union generals. Modern generals tend to stay behind the line, guiding their troops forward. Not the case with Confederates. Often those generals were there on the line of attack. So McQueenie argues these were typical, Confederates were typical Celtic warriors, including pointing out that you have the Celtic cross of St. Andrew as part of the Confederate banner as well. And so when we add the general disadvantage to an attacking side that I had described to you in the lecture on battlefield tactics, with Celtic, if true, but certainly Confederate military recklessness, an aggression, a need to attack, along with the numeric disadvantage of 4-1 in the face of Union forces, and then a general in military doctrine of that time, attack doctrine, urging attack, whether it's on the defense or an offense, you get a very deadly formula for Confederate losses that the Confederacy cannot afford. And so when we break this down, just statistically, we discover that throughout the Civil War, the Confederates tended to attack more frequently than the Union. Confederate forces attack in 8 of the first 12 big battles of the war. And in 8 of these assaults, 97,000 Confederates will be killed, 20,000 more than the Union losses. In the first 12 major campaigns of the war, those in which total casualties exceeded 6,000 men, and battles were Shiloh, Fair Oaks or Seven Pines, 7 Days, Manassas 2, Sharpsburg or Antietam, Perrysville, Fredericksburg, Murfreesboro, Chancellorsville, Vicksburg, Gettysburg, and Chickamauga. The Confederates are on the offensive in all except at Sharpsburg, Fredericksburg, and Vicksburg. Both sides attack for a time at Shiloh, and at Second Manassas, both sides attack for a time. So thus, statistically, the Union and Confederates get one attack each there. So essentially, we're seeing that the South is bleeding to death in the first 3 years of the war by taking the tactical offensive in nearly 70% of the major actions to be fought. The Confederates destroy themselves by making bold and repeated attacks. They take the tactical offensive in 91% of the battles in which they suffered their greatest percentage of losses. They defend it in 89% of the battles in which they suffered the lowest percentage of casualties. In 10 of the 11 battles that cost them their highest percentage of casualties, the Confederates were on the tactical offensive. And in the other battle at Antietam, the Confederates defend themselves by sallying forth with desperate counterattacks, resulting in horrendous casualties. The other thing we see is, as I mentioned, the way Celtic tribal chiefs are going into battle. Confederate generals are dying with their men. 55% of all Confederate generals, 235 out of 425, are either killed or wounded on the battlefield. 21 of the 77 generals killed had been shot at least once before in some other battle. More Confederate generals died leading attacks than in any other way, 70%. In a single charge against federal fortifications at Franklin in 1864, 6 Confederate generals are killed. And so, in conclusion, Confederates took greater risks. They fought more ferociously, bravely, and boldly, aggressively stayed on the offensive. Their generals shared the risks with the men that they sent into battle, and for this reason, they lost. By attacking instead of defending, the Confederacy essentially murdered themselves. By 1865, there were hardly any men left to fight with. And that, essentially, we can argue is not so much why the Union won, but so much why the Confederacy lost.